What's God going to say to us today, I ask myself.
Yes.
Okay, let's just have a look then. Okay, so first of all, this is very in keeping in what we're doing here today, isn't it? Let's look at Jonah again very quickly. Now, I don't know if you know much about Jonah. We know the story. I'm sure most of us know the story of Jonah and the whale. This is something that happens quite often, is that people generally are told by God to do something, and they tend to want to do totally the opposite. It's obviously something that's inborn in us, that we just seem to want to go our own way, like lost sheep. And Jonah went his own way and ended up on a ship and getting shipwrecked because he was going in the opposite direction to what God told him to do. And so obviously he ended up getting swallowed by a very large fish, which we have found through science now that is very possible, and that somebody could survive that. And so what happened then is he's brought back to where he started and effectively, put back onto the beach. And I wonder sometimes whether that happens to us. And as a priest, as a new priest, certainly as a minister of the gospel, and in part of the priesthood, our function is to go and do what God's told us to do and preach the good news to people who need to be saved. And unfortunately, Jonah did not want to go to these people of Nineveh because they were awful people. They were really, really awful. They were terrible people, and he could not, in his whole understanding. And now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you." And so Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, was in actual fact a 3-day journey in extent. Now that must be a pretty big city if you've got to walk 3 days to cover the extent of the city. That's pretty big. And Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. And then he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown." And so the people of Nineveh believed God, proclaimed a fast, and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. And then in verse 10 it says, "And then God saw their works, that they turned from their evil ways." So I wasn't telling fibs, they were evil. They were evil ways anyway. And God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. So this is something that, all ministers should understand, is that when people have not come to God, they are under judgment. And what we're doing is going to people and giving them good news, that they can actually be saved, that they can be restored, that the relationship between them and God can effectually be reconciled. And so they have peace with God. And so it's a wonderful opportunity. It's a very loving, caring opportunity to tell people about the love of God and how God wants to reconcile them to himself. And this is the message, really, that Jonah didn't really fully get, because he was one of God's people and he could not see how these evil people could be saved. And I always remember someone saying that to me when I was saved, that how could God save you? Well, I can understand him saving me, but how come he saved you? And I thought at the time that maybe that person hadn't quite got it right in their understanding of theology. But anyway, but that is sometimes our attitude, isn't it? But the wonderful thing about being a priest is that we can go to people with good news. It's a wonderful vocation, really. And it's a calling. It starts off with an inner calling, and it also needs to be an outward call as well, in that it's recognised by the people of God, by the church. But initially there's that still small voice that calls us to God. and in salvation we come to God. And then there is this further call to serve God in a special way. So it's good that that's where Lee has come to in his journey with God, that he really wants to be part of the priesthood and the ordained ministry in holy orders in the Catholic Church. And so that's a great thing to happen. So let's just move on, because as I say, I don't want it to be a long service today. So let's just move on to the Psalms. I'm not going to say too much about them, but Psalm 62. Psalm 62, verses 6 to 14. Psalm 62, verses 6 to 14 says, "He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defence. I shall not be moved. In God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Surely men of low degree are vapour. Men of high degree are a lie. If they are weighed in the balances, they are altogether lighter than vapour. Do not trust in oppression, nor vain hope in robbery. If riches increase, do not set your heart on them. God has spoken once. Twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God. Also to you, O Lord, belongs mercy, for you render to each one according to his work." So we have a real picture that God is the only one that we can rely on, that he is the one that is our refuge, that we can run to him when things are not going well, when things are bad, and that we must not put our trust in the riches of this life and the things of this life, that we must go back to God. We must put God first in our life. God has got to be on the throne of our life. God has got to be central. Otherwise, our hope is on very dodgy, shaky ground. And we really want to be standing on the rock. And that's what God is. God is my salvation and my glory, the rock of my strength, and my refuge is in God, it says in verse 7. So, we have to trust God with everything. We have to trust God with our life. We have to trust God with our marriage. We have to trust God with our service, with our ministry, with our finances, with our resources, with our children. We have to trust God with those that God has placed in our charge. Because we will be held accountable, it says in Hebrews, that we are accountable for those that God entrusts to our charge. And so we often get to the end of ourselves in ministry. And one of the things that is really important, that you're stepping up in a sense, because you're coming into a new area of ministry now. That is not to say that as a deacon you weren't in a real ministry situation. They are different ministries, and in a sense there is something quite mystical and special that God has set apart for the priesthood, in being the only one entrusted for the Eucharist, where the bread and the wine actually transforms. Now, how it transforms in your mind, in your heart, and by your faith is entirely down to you and your conscience before God. But we know that the old Catholic, the Catholic Church as we know it, right down through the ages, have always